But either way, this is where the PAL deck, at least as of Early Access Update 1.4.1, comes to an end. Or is it? Let's just leave that for next time, shall we? There's something I haven't told you guys about the full roster of PALs within the game of Palworld. In a recent video, I went through the entire PAL deck and read aloud each and every entry in the game, and until the very end of the video, I played that list up to seem like it was complete, a full disclosure of every single PAL this game has to offer. But while I did really look at every PAL that's been released in the game so far, what I didn't include in that video were all of the PALs that haven't been released. During the production of any game, it's not uncommon for more than a few assets, NPCs, or pieces of set design not to see completion. But in the case of Palworld, a game that's gone through redesign after redesign since first being announced, the assets, and particularly the PALs that we've left behind in the process, are of particular interest. Some of these PALs were seemingly only removed from the game near the very end of development, while others have been nearly forgotten entirely due to their seldom appearances even in early material. But regardless of how or why these PALs were scrapped, today I'm going to be going over the full list of unreleased or majorly updated PALs from Palworld's past. Consider this something of a bonus video to go along with the mysteries of the PAL deck upload from a few weeks ago. And unlike that upload, since we have very few PALs to actually discuss today, I'll be doing as in-depth of an analysis as I can for each and every entry here. I hope that you guys find some of this stuff interesting, and without further ado, these are the PALs that exist beyond the PAL deck. Halt. I bring some breaking Palworld news that, in typical fashion, dropped while I was almost done editing this video. Recently, Pocket Pair, the developers of Palworld, dropped a trailer teasing the very first raid battle ever to be added to the game, which, consequently, also will bring with it a new PAL. A PAL that is technically unused at this point, so I wanted to make a brief mention of them within this video, even though they're going to be added to the game probably any day now as of recording. In fact, Pocket Pair's already updated Steam to reflect two new achievements, one for the PAL itself, and one which presumably reflects a new subspecies. Judging by the 40-second trailer used to reveal the feature, raids will be accessible from specific sites left behind by the ancient civilization of Palworld's past, which I talked about in this video, and we can reasonably assume that these fights will be one of the most, if not the single most, challenging pastimes in all of Palworld. In terms of just who or what we'll be fighting inside of the arena, well, meet Bellanoir, a PAL that we can assume will probably be a dark type, not altogether dissimilar in appearance and theming to Lylene Noct. Based off what we've seen from Bellanoir so far, I don't have any assertions as to their significance to the lore, but judging by the veil of meteors which seem to fall from the sky when they're summoned, I wonder if this PAL may have a link to one or more of the calamities stated to have taken place in Palworld's past and future. I've previously said that I thought upcoming content may elaborate on these areas of the lore, and I'm feeling optimistic that upon taking down Bellanoir in this new raid, we may gain access to a PAL deck entry that could hold some of the answers we've been looking for. For now though, we'll just have to wait and see. Only time will tell, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much more. I just thought it was cool since I was already talking about unused PALs and speculating on future content a lot within this video. Just wanted to add this in as a little bonus here in the beginning, but that's all. So anyway, back to your regularly scheduled programming. The first three unused PALs that we're going to be discussing here are not only the most well-known of their fellows, but are likely some of the most poured-over unused assets in all of Palworld. These three are very well-known, and I would bet that nearly everybody watching is probably already familiar with them at this point, but I'm going to go over them here anyway for the sake of being complete. The reason that these three PALs have already been explored so thoroughly is that, unlike the others that we're going to be talking about today, they are currently in the game, or at least within the game code. code, and because of this, through the use of a couple of mods, they can actually be obtained, even if they are ultimately incomplete. Because of this, there's a lot that we know about these pals, almost as much as any other species that actually does exist, in fact, since lots of information such as names, abilities, stats, work suitabilities, and even pal deck entries are available for most or all of these guys. And out of all of the big three, arguably the most well-known, or at least the most infamous, has to be Boltmane. Boltmane is an electric-type pal with a level 2 in Kindling, but otherwise nothing additional in way of work suitability. This pal possesses the Ride Partner skill, which requires Boltmane's saddle, which, as the name suggests, probably made it possible to ride upon Boltmane's back and traverse the land. Its pal deck entry reads, "The more it moves, the more it heats up, and the hair tips increasingly glow brighter. At its peak, it becomes so dazzling that you risk blindness if you stare at it directly." While in principle the idea of a pal that glows as bright as the sun when moving quickly is pretty interesting, sadly, the glowing effect upon its model doesn't actually seem to be reactive within the game. But I guess that makes sense, since nobody would want to engage with this pal at all if they just got flashbanged every time it ran by. Obviously though, at least without mods, nobody has had the ability to partner with this pal at all, owing to its existence purely as a scrapped element and not an official part of the game. But why wasn't Boltmane included to begin with? Well, if you thought it might be because Boltmane's resemblance to Luxray is a little too close to safely be considered its own thing, you may not be far off. Apparently, the models are nearly identical, just with some Pyroar flavor slapped over the top, and I'll admit, that's pretty strange. In earlier pre-release screenshots, this pal's mane is colored a shade of yellow, which is obviously more consistent with its identity as a lightning type, while the in-game model presents a much stronger resemblance to a fire-type pal of sorts. This has long been a topic of discussion in the great Palworld versus Pokemon copyright debate, and admittedly this has struck me as odd as well. If Boltmane actually bore the hallmarks of an electric type, then I don't think this would be too big of a deal to anyone, but being presented as it is sort of questionable. One thing to note is that within the code, Boltmane possesses the Alpha modifier, which potentially suggests that this pal was meant to be used as a field boss, or perhaps even a tower boss at some point in the past. I personally can't help but wonder if Boltmane may have originally been intended as a replacement for either Phalaris or Orsurk within their respective boss towers, since it always was a bit strange to me that the lightning and dragon-type Orsurk fought alongside Axel on top of Mount Obsidian, a volcano, where one would usually expect a fire-type pal to be, and conversely, that the fire-type Phalaris battled alongside Marcus at the PIDF tower in the Desiccated Desert, where a number of notable electric-type pals are generally found. I guess, put another way, a sort of intermingling of the fire and electric types is not exactly something new in Palworld, so perhaps Boltmane is just another victim of this, I don't really know. Either way though, a pretty cool pal. It would be nice if they were altered slightly to actually fit the element they're meant to evoke, but I think there's a definite non-zero chance that we see this one added to the game in future content. The second unreleased pal present within the game's code, unlike Boltmane, doesn't have an official name attributed to it. When loaded in with mods, only the placeholder title, EN Text, is given. But many in the community simply refer to this pal as Dark Mutant, which seems to have been its placeholder name at an earlier point in development. The design of this pal very clearly draws heavy inspiration from Mega Mewtwo Y, although its coloration is obviously quite a bit darker, almost reminiscent, if you ask me, of Shadow Mewtwo, the unlockable Pokken Tournament variant of the character. And although to my knowledge Shadow Mewtwo was never portrayed in either of its Mega Evolution forms, I definitely think that this could be a viable render for what that may have looked like. EN Text is a Dark-type pal with a level 3 in Handiwork, a level 3 in Medicine Production, and a level 2 in Transporting. It has a few unreleased items associated with it as well, including EN Text's Saddle and EN Text's Shotgun, both of which appear to be depreciated. But most notably, there is also EN Text's Power Converter, which is needed to unlock its partner skill, called Telekai Explosion. So there's definitely some psychic-type theming left over from the Mewtwo inspiration as well. Its pal deck entry reads, "Some say that a beam from an EN Text that has perfected its technique can tear holes into other dimensions. It's even believed that certain species of pals were born from such phenomena. Perhaps the technique referred to here is in fact Telekai Explosion, then again, perhaps not. I'm not really sure either way. But I do have a theory regarding some of the pals that may have their origins within these dimensional rifts. Bear in mind that this theory is all in good fun, since we're dealing with elements that haven't seen official release. But my headcanon, at least right now, is that meddling from this PAL may have been what allowed Hellzephyr, Astagon, and Menasting into the Palpagos Islands from another realm. Each of these PALs, which occupy consecutive PAL deck entry numbers, have very clear imagery to hell dimensions associated with them, and I've mentioned before that something about these three has just not sat right with me ever since I first discovered them, as if there was more to their lore that we just weren't quite seeing. So far, I think this brief bit of flavor text has strong potential for explaining some of this away, and could potentially even make for some interesting narrative development should EN text ever see release, with a real name, of course. Also, I nearly forgot to mention that many in the community also believe that this PAL may be a subspecies of Lunaris, but for me personally, I think that a lot of the smaller details on each PAL's body causes them to be just dissimilar enough that I'm not quite inclined to believe this. Instead, I wonder if maybe these PALs have a relationship sort of similar to Pengulet and Penking, where they look very similar, but they're not actually related, if that makes sense. Then, there is the third and final unused PAL within the game's code, that being, of course, Dragostrophe, who, I may add, is positively massive. I believe this may be the largest PAL in the game at present, though I'm not 100% sure. I haven't done any real comparisons, but even if not, they're definitely larger than your average PAL. It's important to note, though, that this particular specimen, like Boltmane, is an alpha variant, so undoubtedly that does fluff up the size a little bit. In early beta footage of the game, the Dragon and Dark-type Dragostrophe was definitively shown to have a field boss encounter, hence its alpha attribute, and was shown to bear the title Lord of the Darkness. In spite of its intimidating title and stature, though, Dragostrophe wouldn't have exactly been the most useful PAL around the base, having only level 3 in transporting, but otherwise devoid of work suitability. Its partner skill, the Black-Winged Shooter, is apparently intended to be accessible after crafting Dragostrophe's shotgun, which evokes some crazy imagery, and its PAL deck entry is a carbon copy of Astagon's, which reads, "A silent beast born of the abyss. Thou shalt not stand before the beast, thou shalt not heed the beast." Perhaps indicating that Dragostrophe may have once been intended as a candidate to join the legions of hell in Astagon's place. Or maybe it's just placeholder text that's since been repurposed. The Pokemon that Dragostrophe is inspired by are also fairly clear, I think. Of course, there's a lot of Reshiram and Zekrom influence in here, but some of the facial features and the red coloration are also indicative of Zoroark. So overall, I feel confident that in general, Dragostrophe may just be intended to evoke that Gen 5 vibe. I really wish I had more to say about this PAL. It's certainly pretty cool and a very interesting addition in my opinion, but sadly, other than appearing in this logo screenshot associated with the time around the 2022 official trailer release, as well as a brief segment where they're present in that trailer itself, there's little else to discuss about them, so let's move on. Now we move on to the unreleased PALs that are not currently included in the game code. PALs that have been seen in previous material, but for which a lot less concrete information exists beyond simply their appearance. And I want to start this section off with one of the oldest unreleased PALs ever to grace the screen, which looks like this. The only time that this greenish-blue wolf cub has ever appeared is when it cameoed in this pre-alpha logo render, and it's been completely MIA ever since. Like all of the other PALs from here on out, this fella is also completely nameless as of yet, but one thing that's particularly interesting is that the PAL is also so old that it actually predates the jump to the modern game's art style and graphic direction, instead presented only in this initial rendering style. Now to be clear, the look of virtually every other PAL here hasn't changed all that much, so it would be reasonable to imagine that it wouldn't look all too drastically different in the modern early access version of Palworld, but even so, since it is a different style, there's probably going to be differences in texture and shading and stuff like that. However, despite that being pretty much all we have to work with, there are some hints within the image itself and in the PAL's design that may clue us into a bit more information about it. First of all, the coloration, along with the shape and placement of its mane, seem to suggest this may have been an ice-type PAL, and when viewed alongside Direhowl, it almost seems like these two may have had some sort of ontological link back in early development. I once again evoke the Pengulet Penguin Dragon King comparison, and I think that potentially a similar dilemma could have been going on with these two as well. That's only a theory, of course. We've never received any official word from Pocket Pair on the significance of this PAL, and of all of the unused PALs that we're going to consider today, I'd say that this one, at least in my opinion, is squarely at the bottom of the list for likelihood to be added to the game anytime soon. But the Wolf Pup isn't the only unused PAL within this pre-alpha render. Next, we've got this PAL right here. Unlike the Wolf Cub, though, the Feather Dragon also has a short appearance during the initial Palworld announced trailer. Now, something that stuck out to myself and many others who have seen this footage is that this PAL seems, in many ways, to be the antithesis to Dragostrophe. Not only does the white and blue color palette directly contrast Dragostrophe's black and red, but the PAL also seems to take similar inspiration from the likes of the Gen 5 dragons. As a result, some of the community have come to refer to this guy fondly as Dragostrophe's cousin. And if we operate under the assumption that these two really were meant to contrast, then I think it might be safe to guess that this PAL would have been a normal and dragon type, or perhaps just a regular dragon type. Unfortunately though, as we already know, the Feather Dragon isn't found anywhere at all within the game code, which insinuates that as development proceeded, any potential for association with Dragostrophe may have fizzled out. After all, if they were to be presented as a pair, we would expect that both would be at least present in the files, but that's just not the case. That being said, although I'm not hopeful for it, I do think it would be pretty sweet to see this one added. Although it does take after Reshiram, the design is certainly unique enough to constitute its own thing. In fact, similarly to the Wolf Pup of before, I think this may actually be one of the more unique PALs in the game. I really hope we get a look at this guy later on, maybe they'll be added in a raid or something like that, but like everything else in this video, I guess only time will tell. Next up though, we have a PAL that many people will probably recognize but may have forgotten about, also seen in the 2022 gameplay trailer, and that's this large flying whale. Despite not being present in the game files, this PAL seems like it may have had a unique aspect that isn't seen anywhere else in the game as of yet, and because of that, I'm kind of leaning toward the idea that maybe we could see it added in the future. As we can see in the trailer, a player and a partner PAL should have been able to ride upon this thing's back, and as of recording, no other flying mount in Palworld offers a feature quite like this, so this seems like it could be pretty cool, and part of me wonders if these whales would have served to ferry players back and forth from places on the ground to structures like this one, which seem to have been planned to be located in the air around Palpagos Island. I'm not sure if reducing this thing basically to the role of taxi really makes that much sense, but either way, they've got a cool design, and it would be nice to see more of these large PALs added. But this PAL's also interesting for a completely different reason, and that is because, even though it's not technically present in the game, its remains actually seem to be. If you look at the giant whale-like skeletons that can be found, especially in the Astral Mountains, you'll see a strange little bony fringe or halo which loops up around the back of the creature's neck, and this is the exact same type of design that we see present on this whale PAL, so it seems like this skeleton may have actually belonged to a member of the species, perhaps even an alpha member judging by its size, at some point in the past. Because of that, maybe we can consider this PAL sort of canon, but maybe they're just extinct? I don't really know. I'm not sure what to make of this from a lore perspective, but from a gameplay perspective, it definitely seems promising. I really hope that we see this one added at some point, and I think that the game itself gives us ample reason to believe that that may not be out of the question just yet. Then of course, we have our final, completely new, unused PAL of today's video, and that is the giant worm or serpent. Now, we've seen a lot of giant PALs today, but I believe this is probably the most massive one of all. There's only a couple of different shots of this thing that actually exist, the first being here, off in the distance of the 2022 trailer, and the second being this really imposing view of the thing's eye from a closer distance, which sort of suggests, at least to me, that this thing may have actually had a cutscene associated with it at some point in time. I wonder if this could have perhaps been a field boss, or maybe may even serve as a raid boss at some point in the future, but what really strikes me about this thing is that I just can't envision it whatsoever as just a normal encounter. I just can't help but feel like this thing must be important somehow, but I can't quite figure out how or where it would be conducive to the story of the game. Perhaps it's just the sheer immensity of this thing, or perhaps it's the association with this shot, but my personal theory is that this may be a candidate for a legendary PAL, to join the likes of Palladius, Necromus, Frostalion, and Jet Dragon. I also think that of all the PALs we've discussed discuss today, this one has the most lore potential. Once again, obviously nothing is confirmed, and this is just my own ramblings on the subject, but could this pal potentially be responsible for one of the other massive snaking skeletons found on the Astral Mountains? I mean, if the unused whale pal can be connected to one of them, then perhaps this thing can too. I don't think it's out of the question. It's definitely an intriguing thought, and I for one will definitely look forward to seeing if and how these elements may come to life in Palworld's future. Before we round out this video today, I just wanted to highlight two more pals, and both of these stem from the very early Palworld announced trailer. Surprisingly though, almost every pal seen in this trailer is included in the final product almost unchanged. That is, except for Mazzarina. You know, that weird pal that's always overflowing with milk, whether it's male or female. Well, there's a very brief scene where we see what appears to be a very early form of Mazzarina here in the trailer, although, as we know, this pal has been changed pretty significantly over time. Obviously, while this pal is not technically unused, this version of it is definitely nowhere to be found, so most likely Mazzarina's old look will stay firmly planted in the past, but it's cool to speculate that maybe it could be added as a alternate version or a subspecies or something. Probably not, but it'd be a neat little Easter egg. The other thing I wanted to mention from this trailer though has to do with the pal Njormungtide, which looks exactly the same as it does during release, but at the very end of the announced trailer, we're shown an NPC that seems to be riding a Njormungtide, not thematically dissimilar to what we see with the tower bosses in early access. Now, obviously, a lot of the tower bosses are based off of characters from Pokemon, such as how Zoe Rain takes after Marnie, and this character is certainly no different, appearing similar to Nessa. So I think it's almost a given that this character was intended to be a test of skill of some kind. Once again, this doesn't necessarily have to do with a new pal, but more of a new version of them, since all of the boss pals in the game are considered within the code to be different variants of the pal which they're based off of, and up until the most recent patch, they were even obtainable through a glitch. I don't know, elements like this are very exciting to me, regardless of how old they may be, because it shows that there were other characters and NPCs created or considered for Palworld at some point. As the game develops, I definitely think it would be cool to see if we get some new tower bosses, or even bosses that may be present outside of towers in different areas of the environment, which seems a bit like what they were intending with this one. I personally would be all for it, and there's certainly a lot of possibility there, so ultimately, I think that's probably the coolest part of all of this. But that's just what I think, and although I've watched these trailers and reviewed these topics a lot of times in preparation for creating this video, it's almost always you guys in the comments that lead me to the really interesting stuff, especially concerning theory videos like this one. As a result, I'd love to know what you have to say, if you have absolutely anything to add, or if you want to challenge something I stated at any point. If there's one thing I've learned from having this channel the past couple of years, it's that sometimes it just takes one comment from someone kind of off the cuff to put a spin on a topic that really changes my perception of it. In addition, if you enjoyed this video, then maybe consider subscribing. This is a little bit different from the type of content that I usually upload, but I love covering all manner of lore, theories, and analyses on this channel, not just relating to Palworld, but to other things as well. So if that sounds cool to you, then I'd love to see you stick around. Anyway, that does it for me for today. This is Averberon. I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.